A little while ago, we finished looking at the second coming of Jesus Christ. Following the coming of Jesus Christ, he establishes his kingdom upon the earth for 1,000 years. This is called premillennialism. The 1,000 years, or the millennium, Christ returns pre or before it. Premillennialism is considered among Western evangelicals to now be the predominant view, not in Christendom at large, because the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, is amillennial in eschatology, but in especially North American evangelicalism, premillennialism is now considered the predominant view. And I mentioned last time that what separates these two views is not the Bible, because both have the same Bible. It's how we interpret the Bible. It's what is called hermeneutics. Each approaches the Bible differently. And so we can look at text after text after text and debate between camps, but really it comes down to the cause of why those texts are interpreted differently, and that has to do with how one approaches the Bible hermeneutically, the rules of biblical interpretation. Historians have noted that for the first century and a half following the apostles, the church was premillennial. This was the almost unanimous view of the early church, that Jesus would return and he would set up an earthly kingdom upon this earth for about 1,000 years. Two things, however, changed that. One had to do with how people, influenced by their culture, began to view this interpretation of the millennium. And that was, they saw it as earthly, physical, where people were indulging themselves. It was almost a sinful environment in which everyone's lusts were fulfilled. That's how people were viewing what the millennium was, that it was this utopian concept, but it was very fleshly, earthly. I'm not sure where they got that they certainly didn't get that from the Bible. That's not how the Bible depicts this future reign of Christ. But this was how it was viewed, that it was seductive and therefore sinful. And so they wanted to say, no, that's not appropriate to this golden age. The other thing was that in one of the mainstreams of Christendom, in what was known as Alexandria, Egypt, there developed there a method of interpretation called the allegorical school, or the spiritualizing school, whereby people like Origen believed that the Bible, because it's a supernatural book, you shouldn't interpret it just by what it says in the pages. But you're supposed to look for a spiritual meaning, and that's the one that's important. And so they looked behind the scriptures, and they found, and that word is in quotations, found meaning in the text, spiritual meaning. The problem with this is that there's no checks and balances, because different people had different interpretations of what was behind the text, and they began to read all kinds of things into the Bible. Now, to continue our history lesson, what happened was Origen and his followers, his disciples, became very influential. And one person in particular who was influenced by this school of thought was Augustine. And Augustine became the most prominent theologian in the world. And Augustine and his theology influenced the Western Church, which became the Roman Catholic Church, which in the vast majority of the world became the only church. The church became amillennial because we needed to reinterpret the Bible spiritually. And so the texts which talk about a literal millennial kingdom, well, they're symbolic language. It's not meant to be taken literally. It's not an earthly literal kingdom. It's Christ reigning in the hearts of his people, Christ reigning from heaven. The millennium is not a 1,000-year period of time, but a long period of time. And what we will see today is even the binding of Satan is a present reality, and it's to be spiritually interpreted. Now, the reason I'm giving you this history lesson is because when we come to the Bible, again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what it says, and then you need to figure out, what does it mean? Should we interpret it literally, or should we interpret it spiritually? I'm going to use the word spiritually, not symbolic, because even those who take a very wooden literal interpretation, and I'm saying they're extreme in that, will understand that there are symbols in the Bible. You can't read the Bible and not see symbols. But we have to understand is that normally when symbols are given, they're explained. We don't care about the symbol. What we care about is, what does the symbol signify? And usually the context will tell you that it's a symbol and it's to be interpreted literally. It's a symbol, but it represents, it signifies this. Now, in order for us to go forward in our just broad panoramic view of Bible prophecy, we have to come individually to a conclusion, a settled conclusion on whether or not we believe that the amillennial interpretation is correct or the premillennial interpretation is correct. Now, you could be a postmillennialist, but the vast majority find themselves in one of those two camps. And what divides them is how you interpret the Bible. Now, you might say that, well, prophecy is a small part of Scripture. That's not true at all. At least 1/4, if not 1/3 of all Scripture was prophetic when it was written. So this has massive implications on how we interpret the Bible. There's a church many years ago that had a search committee, and they were looking for a new senior pastor. And they had a series of people who were on this committee, and they were interviewing somebody and thought, okay, this person's young and energetic, and we like him. But there were several people on the committee who said, well, I have a problem with his eschatology, because the church had been premillennial historically. And this person had said during the interview process, during questioning, that they had recently come to the amillennial perspective. And many people in the committee thought, it's no big deal. It doesn't matter what view you hold. And it was virtually impossible for the people on the committee who knew what the issue really was about to explain to the other people that it's not a peripheral issue. It will affect almost every passage that that pastor touches. Now, this isn't life and death. There are certain hills to die on, and there are ones that aren't hills to die on. But it will, over time, show in how various passages are interpreted. Going through the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew, the theme of Matthew is the Messianic kingdom and the king. And so your eschatology will affect how you read that entire book. When you come to the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, the minor prophets, the theme of the minor prophets is the day of the Lord. It all has to do with the kingdom coming. And so it's no little issue, but it's one that you need to be settled on. I do not think that this is an issue that we should have division over. I think it's one in which we can have perfect fellowship with one another over. This is not something to push us apart. It actually should be something pulling us together, because we all should have a desire, as the Bible says, to rightly divide the word of truth. So, as we're dealing with some of these issues, and you're thinking to myself, oh man, can you get to some more practical stuff in the Bible? This is practical, because this is where you're going to figure out how you interpret the Bible. And if you don't know how to do it, then this will be a lesson on how you should interpret the Bible, at least how I believe it should be interpreted. Revelation chapter 20 is the most controversial chapter in the book of Revelation. And the first few verses are the verses that separate groups. Now, what amillennialists are going to do is, when they come to this passage, they argue for what's called recapitulation. Now, recapitulation just means that something cycles through over again. Now, they see recapitulation throughout the entire book. For instance, you remember that there are 3 sets of 7 judgments. So there's the seal judgments, then there's the trumpet judgments, and then there's the bowl judgment. So you have 3 sets of 7s. So amillennialists see those as referring to the same thing 3 times. They recapitulate themselves. It's saying the same thing slightly differently 3 times. Now, the biggest problem with this is they have to ignore the progression in the judgments. And the progression is, if you look at the judgments, they get worse. Each series is worse than the one before it. But they're forced to have this recapitulation, this cycling, because if you have a chronological progression, then they have a problem when you get to chapter 20, because then you have to have a future earthly kingdom. Now, to repeat, if you do not remember, amillennialists believe that we are in the kingdom now. So the millennial kingdom of what was just read for you about the 1,000 years, Satan being bound and people raising and ruling with Christ for 1,000 years, that's now. For an amillennialist, the kingdom began with the death, burial, resurrection, ascension of Christ. The kingdom began then. So when we read here about Satan bound, Satan is presently bound. We are reigning with Christ now. And this is the key text for that position and for the premillennial position. It has to do with how you interpret this. It's not the only passage, but has been considered the most significant. And so if we're going to talk about a millennium, we need to know, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the present age in which we live? Well, if that's the case, then what we're talking about is a completely different subject than if we're talking about something that is wholly future. So it's not apples and apples, it's apples and oranges. We would be talking about 2 completely different subjects. And so we have to deal with this issue so that we know then, okay, how then do we interpret going forward? because the two millenniums don't look anything like the other. Remember, when we talked last week about the temple, Ezekiel's temple, there is no future temple in amillennialism. We're in the kingdom now. There's no temple. We're the temple. So there isn't a temple that's going to be built in the future. There's none of that. The Antichrist in amillennialism is not a person, but a thing. He's an archetype. Now, the first thing they're going to do is tell you that there is recapitulation. So when we come to chapter 20 is going back in time before chapter 19. Because remember, chapter 19 is the second coming of Christ. All millennials believe the second coming of Christ is to usher in the eternal state. It's not to set up a kingdom, that's now. It has come to set up the eternal state. And so since chapter 19 is universally understood as a reference to the second coming of Christ, you then have to put chapter 20 before chapter 19, at least before verses 11 and following, where it describes the coming of Christ to destroy his enemies. The problem with that is there is no indication in the text that that's what's happening. In fact, look at the opening words. Then I saw. Normally, that phrase in the book of Revelation signals the next event chronologically. Then, the next thing, after this I saw. It's not going back before. Now, what just happened? Well, Christ's return, but there was an interesting thing concerning two individuals that happened. Now, if you read back in Revelation, you see that there's this so-called evil trinity where Satan mimics the Godhead. Satan, as the dragon, functions as a God the Father. And what does he do? He sends his son, who is the Antichrist, who functions as the Son. He is an anti-Christ. And then we have this Holy Spirit figure, who is the false prophet, who doesn't come like the Holy Spirit, who comes not to reveal himself, but the Son. He doesn't come to speak of himself, but the Antichrist. So in context, you're reading along, and this is an argument against recapitulation. We've just found out what happened to two members of that unholy alliance, the Antichrist and the false prophet, who were seized and thrown into the lake of fire. But what about Satan? What about the dragon, the one who empowered them in the first place? What's going to happen to him? That's the next thing that's talked about. So again, we have progression, not recapitulation. Because if you were reading the story and you were really interested in the facts, you would be seeing that it's actually a reverse order here. Because what we have is we have Satan revealed, then we have the two, the false prophet and the Antichrist. Then we deal with the false prophet, the Antichrist. Then we deal with Satan. So it's in reverse order. And so if you're reading along, you see Satan. He calls out this beast who is the Antichrist. He puts all his power and authority and wickedness into this individual. Then there's another one that is there to be his sidekick, who comes to help promote him and to reveal him and really pump him up, the false prophet. And you see the mayhem that is caused by them. Then we see when Christ comes back, these two human beings are thrown into the lake of fire. Then you're thinking, okay, but what about Satan who got all that going in the first place? Is he just going to get some other ones? No. According to chapter 20, verse 1, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. So now we see that something is being done with Satan. Now, there's some symbolic language in here, but not to be interpreted spiritually or allegorically. Let me explain this. So I saw an angel coming down from heaven. There are different interpretations on this. I think the best and simplest one is there's just an unnamed angel. God just sends, he says, you go. That's all there is. And there's something interesting going on here because my understanding of Scripture from Isaiah and Ezekiel and elsewhere is Satan, when he was created by God, was the most beautiful, most powerful, highest ranking of all the angels. And I do not think that there is any angel that can just come and, to use modern language, to just manhandle Satan and drag him off. The thing here is that he is coming from heaven, meaning sent from God with God's authority. How did Christ slay his enemies? By his word. Satan cannot resist because God is powerful enough. All he has to do is send someone, and that's enough. Satan cannot refuse. He has to do God's bidding. And I think that this is really important for us theologically because some people, I'm not sure there's anybody here, but some people are pretty freaked out by Satan and the demonic realm. They have an unhealthy fascination with the demonic realm, thinking that Satan has almost unlimited power, that Satan's almost omnipotent. Satan is a creature, folks. And God, in his infinite sovereignty, Satan can only do what God allows him to do. If Satan is told by God, you are going to the lake of fire, you are going to the abyss, that's the end of the discussion. So do not think that Satan and God are somehow peers in this cosmic battle. That is sheer nonsense. And so if you're in Christ, there's no concern that the devil's going to thwart you. Because God is your God, he is your Father, and you are more than conquerors in him who loved you. So this angel, unnamed, some think it has to be Christ, but in the context that seems very unlikely because Christ has already descended. And there's an angel sent for a specific job. Now, amillennialists are going to say that here is a classic example of why you cannot interpret the Bible literally. And they're going to use this as an argument to bolster their interpretation, which even amillennialists, and I could go and get quotes for you, so I'm not misquoting them, will say that their understanding of this text is not from a straightforward reading of it, but it is theologically in scope. In other words, they have a theological understanding that is read onto the text. And they acknowledge that because the plain meaning of this text is that after Christ comes, he has Satan bound. So what are they going to do? Well, they think the context helps them out. And for somebody like me who holds to the premillennial view, they say that, gotcha. Because angels are what kind of beings? Corporal, non-corporeal? None. They're spirit beings, right? So they say, see, we gotcha. A chain? What's a chain going to do to a spirit being? Hold up here. Does it say that some guy in some shop somewhere down the road made the chain? Does it say what the chain is made out of? Does it say it's made out of steel or iron? No, it says a chain. He came from heaven, and if you read closely, he's got the chain with him. He didn't stop at Home Depot on the way. He brought it with him. In other words, he's bringing heavenly instruments with him. And if you say, well, it's a spirit being, you can't do anything, I'm going to use an earthly term, physical to it. Hold up, read the book of Daniel. There was an angel sent to Daniel, and he says he was hindered by another angel. Well, if you're going to press your point that far, how could a spirit being hold back another spirit being? Or how can it talk about two angels wrestling over the body of Moses? Okay, yes, it's a spirit being, but that doesn't mean that they can't interact on some different level that we don't experience. Otherwise, how can you cast Satan into the lake of fire? How can he be tormented there? How can he even be bound in any sense? So a literal reading understands that, yes, it's a chain, but it's not any chain we're familiar with. So be very careful when you say, oh, we have to interpret these symbols and stuff. And hold up here. There's nothing that says that it's not a chain. The text says it's a chain. Holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. Both those are in his hand. He brings them with him. Now, the bottomless pit is the word abyss. It's used two different ways in the New Testament. The word originally meant something unfathomable. In other words, something that's depths you cannot plummet. So that's why we get words like the bottomless pit. Okay, that is a figure of speech. We know that there's nothing in our reality that's bottomless, that just goes on forever and ever and ever. But the word here is abyss. Okay, in the Old Testament, it's used of the watery deep. It renders a Hebrew word, tehom, which means like the ocean depths. So, because the ocean for them was considered bottomless, it's only in recent times where they've been able to use machines to be able to get way, 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 way down because of the crushing depths. So they thought it was bottomless. That's how the word is used. In the New Testament, it's used to refer to one of two things. It's either the place of the dead, or it refers to a place where demons are held captive, a prison for demons. So the New Testament uses it in both ways. When Jesus confronts the legion of demons that wants to go into the pigs, into the swine, they don't want to go to the abyss, the prison for them, where they're going to be locked up. In intertestamental Jewish literature, so this is literature that was written between the Testaments, between the Old and New Testament. Some of it's contemporaneous with the New Testament. This word is used very, very often for where demons are held captive. And the Bible talks about the fact that some demons are presently being held captive. In fact, in the book of Revelation, we've already seen these demonic locusts that were set free from the abyss, from the bottomless pit. A key was opened, and out of it came this smoke that goes up, and these locust things come out. So the context makes it very clear that it's referring to a prison for demons, which is how it's been used. Now, again, in the Bible, it presents a tripartite creation. You have what's above the heavens, you have the earth, and then below the earth. That's the picture. So the imagery here is one of a shaft going down. Earlier it talks about them coming up out of the shaft. But Satan is taken by this angel that has the key to the bottomless pit, has this chain. He seizes the dragon, the ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and binds him for 1,000 years. Now, again, is this all spiritual? Now, before we move on, I'm going to give you another thing that's used. In the Bible, there are a few passages which talk about a present binding of Satan. But we have to understand, is it the same one that's being referred to? So these are the passages that are used to say that the millennium is now, Satan is presently bound now. This imagery of an abyss and a chain and all this is just symbolic language. Matthew 12:29, Jesus is casting out demons, and it says there, how can anyone enter the strong man's house and carry off his property unless he first binds the strong man? Then he will plunder his house. So amillennials say, see, Jesus at his first coming bound the strong man. Satan is presently bound. Now there's a problem here in that, has Jesus gone to the cross when he utters these words? No. Yet amillennialists believe he was bound through the death, burial, resurrection of Christ. So how can he be bound when Jesus says these words? And what he's saying is Jesus is casting out demons. And so people are questioning about this. And Jesus is saying that the only way that you can cast out demons is to first bind the strong man, Satan. So Jesus is presently casting out demons, which means, according to his logic, he has already bound the strong man, and yet all millennials are telling us that he didn't bind the strong man until his death, burial, resurrection. So what is it? Is he bound or is he not bound? This doesn't work with what they're trying to prove. Because they're saying he was bound at the cross, yet this is him being said to be bound before the cross. It's one or the other. Luke 10, verses 17 through 18. The 70 return. Remember, Jesus sends out the 70, and they return saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I was watching Satan fall from heaven like lightning. Okay, again, they're saying that he's bound. So simple test here. Is this before the cross or after? Before. We have the same problem. If he's bound at the cross, how can you be saying he's presently bound? When it says he fell like lightning, what's going on there, I think, it could be a future reference or a present. If it's a present reference, what's going on is Satan's like, uh-oh, I got to intervene. I got to do something to stop what's going on here. So this is Satan coming in and getting the action because Jesus is undermining everything he's trying to do. Or if it's a prophetic, it's Jesus prophesying about what has been instituted in his person and what he is bringing. If that's the case, he is already talking about the demise of Satan. And it would be other passages would say exactly when it is. But either of those interpretations do not fit with an amillennial one. Because they would say that he's bound then in what Jesus is doing. Another one, John 12, 31 to 32. Now judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world shall be cast out. And I, if I may be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. Now Jesus is saying that judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world shall be cast out. And I, if I be lifted up, will draw all men to myself. That's future tense he's talking about. If I am, if this happens. This doesn't fit either. By the way, the first two I gave you have to do with people who are demon possessed and how this all relates to him. That's all. It's not on a universal stage. And by the way, we'll see in Revelation 20, it's talking about especially Satan's deception of the world. to deceive the nations. This has nothing to do with deceiving the nations. This has to do with people who have been demon-possessed. Colossians 2:15, when he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he had made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Okay, so that's talking about Jesus' victory over the demonic realm. Was the word bound used there? It doesn't mention anything about Satan being bound. It says they were disarmed. Everybody agrees that Jesus won at the cross. It's over. Okay, there's another point for comfort if you're a Christian. What was done cannot be undone. If Christ was victorious at the cross, and he was, that victory stands for eternity. There is no plan B for Satan where somehow he can come through the side door and win. It's over. Hebrews 2:14-15. Since then the children share in the flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and might deliver those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. That's talking about salvation. Christ came and he conquered the devil through his giving of his self on the cross. Now, if I give you a biblical illustration of this, go back to Genesis chapter 3. What did God say to Eve about the serpent and her seed? Bruise his heel, crush his head. That's what's going on here. Christ in his work on the cross crushed Satan's head. He defeated him. It's not talking about him being bound. Because we're going to see here is, how are we going to put other passages together? If you're going to argue that Satan has been presently bound and that he can't go out and do his work of deception, you have a problem with a whole lot of other Bible verses. 1 John 3:8, but the Son appeared for this purpose, that he might destroy the works of the devil. What happened on the cross? He destroyed the works of the devil. Does that mean the devil isn't still doing stuff? No, he can't win. He can't prevent the cross. Revelation 12:9. And the great dragon, that's Satan, was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, and deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So amillennialists are going to tell us that Satan, those texts tell us Satan is presently bound. If that's the case, logic demands what is being talked about in Revelation 20 has to be present as well. So in the context, it says Satan being bound, but it also says for 1,000 years. So the kingdom and the binding correlate. They're tied together. If that's the case, if one is true, the other must be true. If Satan is presently bound, then the kingdom must now be operative. So that's their logic. Their logic is, one, recapitulation. This happens before. Number two, Satan is presently bound. And since the kingdom and the binding go hand in hand, therefore the kingdom must be present. And that affects what they do with God's program for Israel, for instance. If God talked about a restoration of the nation of Israel, putting them back in the promised land, he talked about a temple being built, all these things, you have to get rid of that because it doesn't fit. We don't see that going on. And you can't argue, well, Israel's in the land now. Hold on here. You can't argue that, because if the kingdom began with the ascension of Christ, then it would have to pertain to starting then. So what do? Again, they use a spiritualizing interpretation. And again, if anybody thinks I'm mudslinging, all you have to do is pick up some books written by amillennialists, and that's the very terms they use. The best one ever written on it was by a guy named Oswald Alice, who the first part, I think it's called Prophecy in the Church. The first section of the book is all on how to interpret the Bible. And he doesn't hold anything back. He tells you exactly how they interpret. Now, again, let me step back for a second here, because I do not want to come across as I think that I'm better than them. It's not. I've just chosen what I believe is the right path. That's all. I made a choice that I believe this is how you interpret the Bible. And with that come the ripple effects. If I choose to throw a pebble in that pond, then the ripples go out that way, not that way. If I throw one out this way, the ripples go that way. So you have to choose. How do you read the Bible? That's all it comes down to. Each side says, we're right. I was talking to somebody, they were asking me about this recently. It wasn't somebody from the church, but they called me up and they said, I noticed that you've been preaching through such and such. And they said, how do you deal with this? And I said, listen, I can't each week just say, this is what that view says, this is what that one. I said in the beginning, I just said, this is what I believe, this is how I believe it should be interpreted, and then this is where it leads. One of the biggest problems, I think, in the church today is that we do not teach people how to read the Bible properly. And I mean at a significant level. We try to model it and things like that, but if you guys were willing and really would sign up, we need to set aside a time and go through probably a Bible college level or seminary level course in how to interpret the Bible. Because then we wouldn't have to deal with this stuff. We would all be on the same page. And if I diverge, you're going to say, okay, I see what he's doing there. Anyways, if we get enough interest, I will do that. Back to the text. So we had recapitulation. We had a way or model or method of biblical interpretation, which says that this is to be interpreted symbolically. And then we see in the opening, it uses language that they believe demands that the whole thing be interpreted spiritually, because it talks about a chain, and it talks about grabbing him or seizing him. That you can't do that to a spirit being. Therefore, we have to take the whole thing spiritually. And I say nonsense. The text implies progression. This is the next chronological thing. And in fact, things are progressing, escalating. They're moving upward and forward. When it talks about a chain, it's a real chain. We don't know what it looks like, how it works, but it works. Not only that, the text goes to great points. Okay, so bear with me here. I know I'm jumping around a bit, but there's so much I want to say, and in my mind right now, I'm removing stuff for time's sake. So I gave you some of the passages that amillennialists use to say that Satan is presently bound. But if we look at other texts, we have to say, okay, how do we work with these ones as well? Because look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world, that is Satan, has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Is that not the work of Satan? If he is bound, how is he at the same time blinding the minds of unbelievers? His chief work right now is keeping people from seeing the glory of Christ and his gospel. That doesn't sound like, by the way, if that's the case, how is that different than what happened before? Do you think in the Old Testament, Satan didn't want people from coming to faith? And unless you misunderstand, there's one way of salvation from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22. Everybody has only and always been saved by faith. Faith alone, that's it. Satan doesn't want anybody to believe the gospel and be saved. So how did that change with some so-called binding at the death, burial, resurrection of Christ? That same work is going on, and I would argue Satan is up the ante big time. 2 Timothy 2:26, and they be come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil, having been held captive by him to do his will. It's talking about Satan baiting traps for people. So they'll do what, so he's bound, and yet he's still blinding people's eyes. He's still setting traps all over the place. 2 Corinthians 11:3, but I am afraid lest as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your mind should be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. Now, if you read the text carefully, it's Eve gave way to the tempter's deception, and he's afraid they're going to do the same thing. Well, if Satan's bound and he can't deceive, how is he deceiving? Revelation 12, verse 9, the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who was called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Now, note it says, who deceives the whole world? Now, that Revelation chapter 12, that throwing down is future, and it happens near the end of the tribulation period. And then Satan goes nuts because he knows his time is short. See, right now, Satan has access to heaven. Okay, again, you may not be aware of this. Job 1 and 2 make it very clear. He appears before God, and God says, where you been? What have you been up to? I've been going across the world back and forth, and then God says, have you considered my servant Job? So Satan goes up to heaven. He still does, because he's considered, one of his names means the accuser. So he goes up and yaps in God's ear and said, did you see what brother Joe did? I think you need to get him. So he's accusing Christians, telling God, you know what, these people aren't worth it. You should just cast him aside. You should get rid of him. You should throw him in hell. He deserves it. And that's where Christ is on the other side, saying, you know what, Father, my blood covered that one too. Revelation 16, verses 13 to 16, I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon and out of the mouth of the beast and out of the mouth of the false prophet 3 unclean spirits like frogs, for they are spirits of demons performing signs which go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war of the great day of God Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his garments, lest he walk away naked and men see his shame. And they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Armageddon. So we see in those passages Satan presently at work. So what is it? Is he bound? Is he not bound? What does the binding mean then if Satan can do all this stuff? Remember, Peter says Satan's a roaring lion going to and fro, seeing whom he may devour. Well, we went through Ephesians 6, 10 through 20. It says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And this is who our war's against, that we may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Now, keep all that in mind. Let's see what the text says about the actual binding, just the language of it. Does it imply it's some sort of metaphorical binding or a literal one? Is it partial or complete? So, key to the bottomless pit, great chain. Seized him, and that's a strong term, seized. The dragon, the serpent, it was the devil and Satan, and he bound him for 1,000 years. So he bound him. Now, he doesn't just bind him. So he doesn't take him to the street corner, throw a chain around him. No. By the way, the word chain can also mean manacles or handcuffs. So it's an instrument used to bind a prisoner. So however you interpret it, that's the meaning in the context. Now, if that weren't enough, it says then he threw him into the pit. Okay, pit in the abyss, same thing. Shut it and sealed it. Now the seal is like the seal they put on Christ's tomb so that it was tamper-proof. Now just stay with me here for a second. Just put on your common sense, plain reading for a second. What is the purpose of taking someone, putting them in a pit, which, by the way, when he's released is called a prison? So he's taken to a place that's called the abyss, it's called the pit, it's called his prison. He's not only put there, but he is bound. It is covered over and sealed. In fact, the imagery is interesting. It's almost like he's put in a tomb. So you're stuck away. By the way, the abyss is considered a place disconnected from where we are. So it's not something that is all around us. It's we're here, it's somewhere else. So he goes somewhere else. He's put in this. He is bound. It is covered over and sealed. Amillennialists are going to tell us that what it is God is just limiting what he can do. And what they do is they say, yeah, he's chained, but it's a long chain. It's like a long leash. The chain is the least of his worries. Because he's in a different place and it's covered over and sealed. He can't get out. Whether he's chained or not, he cannot get out and he cannot influence anybody. He has zero contact with anybody. One scholar used the idea of solitary confinement. Why do you put a prisoner in solitary confinement? So they have no impact or contact with anybody else. They can't do any damage, any harm, nothing. You put them away under lock and key so that they cannot influence or contact anyone. It's solitary. Satan is in solitary confinement, although he's with the demons. I tried to research this a bit more, but basically this is one of the great assumptions in the Bible, is that everyone assumes that when it says Satan is bound, it's Satan and the demons. What's the purpose of this, by the way? I'm going to give you something that's ahead of next week, but just so we can take a breather for a second. What's the purpose? Why bother binding him for 1,000 years? Because it says, and then he must, divine necessity, be released. According to Paul, there are 3 enemies that each of us face. What are the 3 enemies? The world, the flesh, and the devil. During the millennial kingdom, 2 of those are going to be knocked off. Christ will reign with a rod of iron in perfect righteousness and holiness. Any sin will be dealt with swiftly and immediately. So the kingdom will be a place of righteousness and holiness. Yes, there's going to be sin there. We talked about that's part of what the sacrificial system will be about ceremonial cleanness. But it's going to be a place where you can't say, well, it's culture. It's the society that made me do it. No, the society is one of holiness and righteousness. You can't say the devil made me do it, because the devil and the demons are locked away, having no influence or impact upon you. During the millennial kingdom, we're going to find out that at the end of it, a whole mass of humanity still won't believe in Jesus Christ. He's there in his glorified, resurrected body. He is reigning in righteousness and holiness. Satan is bound, and people still won't believe. So what does that tell you about your heart? Was Jeremiah right? The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. So why is he bound? Well, in one way, it's going to prove human depravity, that we are sinners. And even if God puts us in a paradise, without his grace, we're still going to rebel and reject. So it says here that he was seized, he was bound and thrown into the pit and shut and sealed, that he might not deceive the nations any longer. One amillennialist who actually undermined his own interpretation, but he did it on purpose, trying to be honest with the text, said that phrase here, he might not deceive the nations any longer. That phrase any longer means he is currently doing it. This is a problem. That he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a while. Amillennialists, because we see the deception going on, they want to talk about the work of Christ. And here, some of them get themselves into a very difficult place. They paint themselves into a corner. Because what they're trying to say is that Satan is currently undermining the gospel. Not just people preaching the gospel, but the gospel itself. And when Satan is released, he's going to undo the work of Christ? No. When Satan is defeated, it is forever. And so they can't find any purposes for Satan being released. After that, he must be released for a little while. By the way, there's also another chronological problem that they have. Because they believe currently we're in the kingdom, then we have the eternal state when Christ returns. But here, they're talking about the fact that he is going to come and deceive the nations after the kingdom in relation to the eternal state. That doesn't make any sense at all. In conclusion, approaching the millennial kingdom, whether it's a literal kingdom or a symbolic one, comes down to how you interpret the Bible. And I cannot emphasize that enough. When you look at the book of Revelation just on its own, we see progression. What we see is the language of progression. Then I saw. Even verse 4, then I saw. Verse 7, and when the 1,000 years were ended, Satan will be released from his prison, that he will deceive the four nations. Okay, and then there's a battle that happens and such. But we see chronological markers going through this whole thing. Verse 1 of chapter 19. After this I heard. And then it goes on. Verse 6. Then I heard what seemed like. Then it goes on. Verse 11. Then I saw. Verse 17. Then I saw. These are throughout the book of Revelation markers of chronology. This happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. There's no recapitulation going on here. There's no recycling. It's the next event. Christ comes back, Antichrist, false prophet, thrown into the lake of fire. What about Satan? Well, we're going to deal with him too, but we're going to deal with him slightly differently. He's going to be bound, thrown into the abyss for 1,000 years so he can't deceive anymore. Then he's going to be released. He's going to gather an army together of unbelievers who are going to make war against God. Know what it says. And we'll get to this next time. When the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison, will come out to deceive the nations that are the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. their numbers like the sand of the sea, and they marched over abroad, and they come. What's God do? It says fire came down from heaven and consumed them. So Satan's released. These people who reject Christ are going to follow him. The shortest battle in history is going to happen, and then we have the judgment scene. There is no reason to take this in a non-literal sense. This is the only place in the Bible where the length of the kingdom is told. 1,000 years. I believe it's 6 times it uses that phrase. Okay, verse 2, bound him for 1,000 years. Verse 3, until the 1,000 years were ended. Okay, the end of verse 4, they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. Okay, verse 6, he will reign with him for 1,000 years. Verse 7, and when the 1,000 years are ended. Okay, if he wanted to say a long time, he could have just said a long time. People say, well, if you read the book of Revelation, all the numbers are symbolic. No, they're not. He wrote to 7 churches. That's a literal number. 7 churches. 144,000 is a literal number because it breaks it down. It says, oh, and by the way, it's 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. The two witnesses, well, that's a literal number. There's 2 of them. We have the number of months of the tribulation. It says that he would be able to go for 42 months. Gives the number of days which coincides with. That's literal numbers. So be careful just throwing stuff out and say, oh, it's all symbolic. No, it's not. And by the way, most of the symbols in the language, does the Bible assume when you read the New Testament that you've already read the Old Testament? Yes. So they assume that you know what came beforehand. So when you see the references to Isaiah, the references to Daniel, the references to Ezekiel, the references to Jeremiah, they assume that you know what's going before. So you know what the symbols represent. So don't just say, well, it's symbolic, and then we make it mean what it doesn't say. Okay, going forward, a literal earthly millennial kingdom, 1,000 years. Satan is not presently bound. He is a roaring lion going to and fro, seeking whom he may devour. That is a literal reading of the text. In the future, he and his demons will be bound and thrown into the bottomless pit where it will be sealed over and covered, and he will have zero influence on anyone. Zero. Then he will be released. So this is how we read the Bible. We don't make it say what we want it to. We read it for what it says. So hopefully that was helpful. Going forward, we're going to be seeing maybe some things that you've never seen before. And what's it going to be like during this time period? What are we going to do during the millennial kingdom? Who's going to be there? Are people going to die? Are people going to have kids? All these sorts of things. We're going to see there's still going to be nations there. But Satan won't be there.